notion of its being easily bifurcated. Well, anyway, whoops, I thought what happened to our music? Ah, there's my green light. Okay, now we're ready to go. My music quit, my green light hadn't come on. I was so confused. I felt like Rush Limbaugh. Anyway, here we are. We're continuing our discussion of interpersonal communication, which focuses on relationship development. This chapter does anyway. And we've looked at the rationale for this kind of study. Where did it come about? How does it sort of consume our interest? One of the points that I could have made the other day is that it's largely the product of the 60s. We hadn't paid a lot of attention to interpersonal communication until the 60s. And then for a variety of reasons, we got very, very interested in it. And part of it was, ironically enough, the whole mood of the 60s. Because the nature of relationships became a sort of consuming question of parents, your parents, people your parents' age and all of that kind of stuff. We had a love movement. We had love in. We were going to love everybody. And out of understanding love and understanding harmony, dealing with some of this, we had a lot of self-help psychology. We had existentialism. People who were interested in how we could be so destructive to ourselves as a world, as a people, as a society. We sort of began to develop the notion of, well, what can we do to study interpersonal communication? Because maybe interpersonal communication is where it all happens, what it all comes down to. And so it was very much launched. And where we ended our discussion last time was in a very long list of potential variables, sort of tantalizing you to say which of these variables in what combination really makes a big difference as to the nature and the quality of relationships. For instance, we like to talk about things like openness. Well, then we talk about disclosure. We talk about rules and compliance and exchange. We talk about social exchange theory. Well, there's a theory, a group of researchers, a team of researchers that we can get our next transparency up. Thanks. Edna Rogers, and Frank Millar. Oops, that should be Rogers and Millar. M-I-L-L-A-R. I say that because that'll help you to find it in the book. Their work is largely presented on pages 238 and for the next 2 or 3 pages. And I mention that because I'm going to go over a lot of definitions today, which are infinitely a lot more easily managed by you reading them in the book than me writing or saying them so that you can write them down. But what they argued was that there are 3 key terms that seem to define the quality of a relationship. And then we'll see what those words are. They're actually control, trust, and intimacy. We'll see more about those in a minute. The larger question to them was, well, how do we co-define something like control? How do we co-define something like control? Can certain people in a relationship have a disproportionate amount of control? Should they have a disproportionate amount of control? We have a very, very interesting case, which I'm not going to dig into in real deep detail here, because by the time other people see this video, we will know some of the answers as played out in court. But one of the questions that is being addressed in a court in Eagle, Colorado, is in what sense did one person violate another person's sense of control over relational elements? Kobe Bryant case. I say that because that's on video, and then people will know what I'm talking about in history. And those of you here today, in what sense does, this is an issue from our point of view, did Kobe take advantage of control? To what extent did the young woman actually yield control? But control, in a sense, is co-defined, isn't it? It's co-defined. Should parents have disproportionate amounts of control over their children? We often say, she can't control her child. Is that bad? Is that good? I have a workshop in the country, and my grandson was out there with me the other day, and he wanted to use my shop tools. No, you're not big enough. And I can't explain to him how big he's got to be. If I said you got to be 8 or 10, he doesn't know what that means. He can count to 10, but what does it mean? But if I say you got to be this tall, oh, well, I understand that, right? It's the same way that people down at Astroworld would communicate. You got to be this tall. So we did use some of the tools under careful control. I had all the control. Is that wrong? See? So what we do is we define control in various ways. We negotiate control. One of the assumptions that we might make in relationships is that control always has to be evenly distributed, and that may be incorrect. But ultimately it should be something that is comfortable. Well, then we talk about adolescence. Control is never comfortable to adolescents, is it? They always think parents have too much control and they have too little control. Well, okay. Co-defined, negotiate. Negotiate, control. Negotiate trust. Do we have to prove to people that we are trustworthy, that we could be trusted? And through intimacy, how do we communicate? And intimacy can include physical intimacy, but we also know that it can simply be relational intimacy in that term as well, or in that venue as well. Well, let's take a look at these particular terms in more detail. And like I say, I tried very hard to get all the definitions in the book. Page 238 I've written in my notes here. What I want to do is to sort of give the definition, but more importantly, alert you to what I'm talking about, and then let you work with the book to get the definitions that you might want to use in either writing an essay question on this, because an essay question, I think one of the review questions might be, in terms of talking about a relationship, what does it mean when we say control, trust, and intimacy? What do these terms mean, etc., etc. Now, what's also interesting is that each of these terms, control, trust, and intimacy, has 3 subterms or subvariables or subconcepts underneath. And it's best to think of these as variables, a concept that varies, because control can be high or low, it can be shared, or it can be lopsided. And it's usually not binary, dichotomous variable, it's usually continuous. Well, what is control? Let's talk about control. It is the right and ability to define, direct, and limit actions. It's the right and ability to direct, define, and limit actions. As your parent, do I have the right to limit your actions? Is that okay? If you and I are good friends, do I have the right to limit your actions? Can I say to you, if you and I are friends, that's unfair? Shouldn't do that? Shouldn't say that in that way? We can work it out, but it's a way of defining what is appropriate, what is inappropriate, in terms of what happens and the outcomes that happen in our relationship. We talk about social exchange. Social exchange says that there are norms of reciprocity. If you don't reciprocate what I do, in a sense, I've yielded something to you which you've not given back to me. You're taking control of that exchange, and I think maybe that's unbalanced, and I don't like that. See how it works? Redundancy. Redundancy is a subvariable of control, and it simply means the question of whether we use the same control mechanisms over and over again, or we use a variety of control mechanisms. Now, any of you that have ever gone through animal training school, and I've gone through it once with an animal, a dog, and the person doing the dog training says, we're not actually training dogs, we're training owners. Because first of all, we got to convince the owner that the dog can be trained and that there's a way of doing it. And one of the things that you learn is that every command that you give has to be the same command for the same response. Sit, for instance, right? Sit. Lie down. Down. Whatever it might be. Off. Simple words. Dog doesn't have a big vocabulary.
has a good sense of smell and memory, but words baffle them. You know, sort of like the conversation in the world to a dog is Fido, meal, Fido, meal, and that's all the vocabulary the dog figures it needs, is its name and food. So that's the sort of Snoopy view of the world, isn't it? So redundancy of the kinds and amounts of tactics that are used. And we sometimes find it frustrating if control tactics are too varied. We feel that we're being manipulative, don't we? By the same token, if everything is met with a sense of rigidity, we may find that that's inappropriate, particularly if it's unyielding over time. Unyielding over time, meaning that as a parent, isn't there something that goes along in terms of a progression of yielding control to your children as they mature and they become, in your judgment, more responsible for the use of control in a reasonable way, meaning the choices that they can make. We sometimes allow children to pick out their clothing. My granddaughter the other morning came out. Daughter said she picked out her clothing. My wife says looks pretty good. But any of you that have been around your children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews know that sometimes their selection makes them look pretty weird, but is that okay? Who cares? If they think they look nifty, maybe that's fine. You see what I'm saying? Is maybe they ought to be able to do that. Maybe they ought to be able to make certain choices. But by the same token, if every meal they want ice cream, now I would sympathize with them, but maybe that's not the best thing for them. Maybe they really do have to have some carrots and something else in their diet. See what I'm getting at? How it works? And redundancy means that we use these control techniques and the extent to which we change and adapt those control techniques. By the same token, we know that some people can use these with a sort of infinite clever variety, and that can lead us into something along the line of manipulation. Dominance. Dominance is simply the ratio of the control or power moves on the part of A to B. We often counsel our peers saying, don't let her dominate you like that. Don't let him dominate you like that. Don't let your parents dominate you like that. Yeah, I can. But like I say, it's in the book. It's a lot easier to get it out of the book, right? But it is the ratio of power or control moves A to B. I'm A, you're B. If I'm dominating you, and if I'm domineering, it's because I exercise control over you in every way, in every option. More shared and balanced control, right, is when you have opportunities to influence me. And influence is a part of what we're getting at here. And you say, well, influence, isn't that theme that sort of runs throughout what we've been talking about? That's the nature of interpersonal communication and the nature of persuasion and maybe even the nature of communication. Influence. I influence you by what I say, by what I do. And to what extent do I control you? To what extent do I dominate you? One can argue that we build in children the ability to make good decisions by not dominating everything that they do. And there is some literature that suggests the more that you deny children the ability to develop decision-making skills, you make them more likely to make decisional errors in their life because they're not prepared to make crucial decisions at crucial times in their life. So the ratio of A and B. Maybe we at various times give children choices to make in a very controlled way because what we want to do is to help them to learn to develop this. But the same token, children can be tyrants, can't they? Children can be tyrants. Infants are by nature. When an infant is unhappy, everybody's unhappy. And it isn't something that the child is just doing, it's that the child is being. That child is unhappy, hungry, or whatever it might be. But then when they get to be 3 or 4, you can kind of begin to discern. We're talking now about deception. When are they seeking dominance as opposed to when are they honestly trying to influence? I won't eat that. I won't eat that.
I grew up in a family that said, well, okay, that's fine. You won't eat that. That's all there is available. And the chances are in the next week or two, you'll decide that that's not pretty bad after all, right? So you're fine. Go ahead. Go about your life, whatever you want to. Then in a few minutes, well, I really want this. Nope, sorry. That's not available. Restaurant is closed. There's a close sign over here. Is that okay? Right? See what I'm getting at? Is that okay? Because it's control, isn't it? It's the way all of this goes on. Dynamics of interaction. Power. The third variable, power, is simply the ability to constrain actions and outcomes. Power. Interesting case. Some of this we can apply to organizational communication. I'll probably tell the story again. I love it. Guy working on a drilling rig accidentally dropped a tool down the shaft when the drilling bit and drilling pipe was pulled out. Falls down. They call the engineers in to decide whether it's cheaper to drill through the tool or it is cheaper to fish for it. That's a term actually used in the industry, to fish it out rather than to drill through it. They decide to fish it out rather than to drill through it. The foreman gets the tool, hands it to the worker and says, there's your tool, now you're fired. And the worker says, well, then I don't need the tool any longer, and dropped it down the hole, right? Power, the ability to influence outcomes. You're driving your car along the highway, power, right? The ability to influence outcomes. You're taking of examinations, you're talking with other people, the ability to, well, again, we talk about this notion that persuasion is a part of the business of interpersonal communication. Trust. Some of you voiced the notion of trust when you talked about what are the key variables. Trust. What do we mean by trust? One of the ways to define trust is that it has something to do with uncertainty. Trust has something to do with uncertainty. In a sense, it is an uncertainty as to the amount and use or kind of control that can be exerted in a given situation. Ever drive along on the highway and see that person that's continually cutting in and out and going in and out, and some of you say, no, that's not somebody I see, that's who I am. Do you then after a while back off from that person and say, just get out of my world, I can't trust you not to do something stupid? It's the bozo factor, isn't it? If we think we can't predict outcomes and uncertainty increases, we may then take some kind of protective response. Does that make sense? If I'm in a relationship and I can't predict, you become too uncertain to me, am I likely then to say it's too costly? I don't like this, it's uncomfortable, I want out of this situation? I can't trust you, you are not predictable. So this is why I said the other day when somebody said that being unpredictable is a good characteristic in a relationship. And I think I said, up to a point. Up to a point. Because we like to be able to believe that we can take the person for granted a bit, maybe a lot. Because we want to know what they're going to do, how they're going to respond, and when they respond in erratic ways, that can sometimes be problematic. When they respond in manipulative ways so that we never know when we can trust them to be playing the game honestly, predicting outcomes, etc. You see what I'm getting at? Why don't we trust people at the used car lot? Because we think we're playing with their cards on their table and there are mirrors behind us. They've got more control, more power over the outcome of the sale of an automobile than we do over the purchase of an automobile. Well, what leads to the concern about trust? Part of this is vulnerability. Vulnerability. Vulnerability is the subjective cost of risking. It's the subjective cost of risking. If I give you $10 and say, now pay me back, is there some issue of trust there? because you could not pay me back. You might not pay me back. Your friends, do you have some friends that you will loan stuff to and other friends that you won't? Isn't that then a counterbalance of control? Control and trust work together? Because I don't know that you'll give it back. You give me $10. I'll be sure to give it back to you. How many of you are going to show up after class? Give me $10. You're a trustworthy guy, or you think I'm a trustworthy guy, right? Vulnerability is the subjective cost of risking. Out on the highway, you've got somebody that seems to be driving drunk, crazy, erratic. You become vulnerable to them because what they do can hurt you. Subjective cost of risking. When we say, I love you to somebody, is there a subjective cost in saying something like this? Because they might look at us and say, you must be kidding. You really must be kidding. You're my boyfriend, girlfriend. You're my best friend. You must be kidding. Or I will simply use that now to take advantage of you. I have power over you. I can use that. I can even go so far as to say, if you love me, you will do the following things, right? Which is control, taking advantage of trust or vulnerability. Reward dependability. Reward dependability is that payback, isn't it? Now, I grew up as a younger brother with an older sister, and when she said, if you do that, I will hit you, I thought that was pretty reward dependable, because she had a habit of doing that. But she also was a person who could beat up other people, which I thought was a pretty good deal going for me, because I could always say, my sister will beat you up. People would say, aren't you a wimp? Well, I don't have a bigger brother that can beat you up, so I'm stuck with an older sister. At least I've got somebody, right? Isn't that part of the game that we play? I'll go get my brother. What's your brother going to do? He's going to beat you up. Reward dependability. I can give you a punishment or I can give you a reward. You're my best friend. Let me play with the toy today. I'll let you play with the toy when it's my birthday, etc., etc. Do you reciprocate? Are you dependable? Why, when we say to somebody, I love you, do we expect them to say, I love you back? Why? Because it's reward dependability. It is giving us back the assurance that our vulnerability is not being taken advantage of. Confidence. This is interesting, isn't it? Confidence. How much vulnerability can you tolerate? How much vulnerability can you tolerate? A lot or a little? We often talk in a romantic sense about the clinging vine. Why are some people clinging vines? Is it arguably because they aren't confident that they can let you out of their sight? Why do we have some people abnormally jealous? Is jealousy a normal, reasonable part of a relationship? Is obsessive jealousy irrational by this logic? Because it says, doesn't it? I have no confidence in my ability to trust you, meaning I can't be vulnerable to you. So therefore, I try to keep absolute control of you all of the time. Does that make sense? See how it works? Or does it work? Is that the way the world works? I say that because theory is supposed to explain the world. It's supposed to discover patterns, illuminate those patterns, and make predictions. Is that what happens? The argument then is the more we properly co-manage these variables, they ought to lead to better relationships. And the more that we make these variables dysfunctional, the more that we would have dysfunctional relationships. Is that the way this goes? Is that the logic that runs throughout this? Whatever. All right. That's the essay question then, right? We flip the page. We go to intimacy. Intimacy can include, as I said before, physical intimacy, and I don't want to go too far down that road. We'll even later on in uncertainty reduction theory talk about intimacy moves. Intimacy moves. I might, for instance, put my arm around you. I remember I think, the first time I ever put my arm around a girl. I do remember the first time I ever kissed a girl. And isn't kissing an intimacy move? What happens if you try to kiss and somebody pokes you in the nose? See what I'm getting at? It's a reciprocation, isn't it? So it can be physical, but it also can be simply emotional intimacy moves, can't it? It can be something along that line, like saying, I like you, I brought you flowers. This is back to our sort of social exchange. I want you to know that you are, in some sense, important to me. We use others to self-confirm. Is that the whole point of intimacy? That's what we discuss as we look at it from Rogers and Millar's point of view. We use other people to self-confirm. Am I a likable person? It means that I've got to create a situation where I'm liked. Does that make sense? If I'm a likable person, I have to create a situation where I'm liked. Why do we like certain people as our friends? Because they like us? We want them to like us. We'll see in a minute attachment is exactly that variable. Exactly that variable. Now, with intimacy, and we used the word transferability the other day to talk about taking on your baggage. Here we're going to use transferability a little bit differently. It's close, but a little bit differently. But that's all right. Either of these we would know what you're talking about. To what extent do certain people play exclusive roles in your life? Meaning that they are special because they do certain things for you. And your intimacy is not, in a sense, then transferable to everybody. And then we see the word exclusive coming in here because some people are exclusive to us in a relationship. Now let's play that out a little bit more. Any of you remember what is the traditional set of marriage vows? What does it say? Something about keeping each exclusive to the other. Doesn't it say something like that? We go so far. Do you remember when we talked about coordinated management of meaning? No, I don't remember coordinated management of meaning. That was the last unit. We talked about wedding archetypes and then the scripts that go along with that. Exclusive to us. You and I now are husband and wife, or wife and wife, or husband and husband, or whatever the combination might be. And we're exclusive to one another. Exclusivity simply means the extent to which you are unique in what you do in self-confirmation. And I asked you the other day, for instance, if you do something that's really great, and you had 22 people to call to tell that you just got a wonderful job at a great salary, who would that first call go to? You might say, well, the person who I think is available. Well, it might be, but maybe not. Nowadays, we don't ever expect anybody to answer the phone. Or we expect them always to answer the phone. But who would be the first person that you would call? The argument would be that is the person that is most exclusive to you, at least on that topic. Years ago, there was a kind of interesting little ad by the Church of the Latter-day Saints that talk a lot in their advertisements about family values. And a little boy came home from school and he had something to say, and his mom was busy and his dad was busy and an older sibling was busy, and so there he is at the end of the ad out on the back porch with his arm around his dog, telling his dog what a wonderful thing that had happened to him that day. The dog in that case was then really exclusive, wasn't it? It's the one person. Is Grandma exclusive? Is Grandma the one person that will always listen to you and say that no matter what's happened, you're still her favorite? You're still wonderful? You see what I'm getting at? Exclusivity. One of the assumptions that we make is often that if we're in a romantic situation, our romantic partner may be extremely exclusive to us. We don't transfer a lot of these things beyond, but in every romantic relationship, isn't it likely that we've got a platonic friend out there that is probably as important to us as even our romantic mate. Is that possible? Yeah.
When you say confirm, like self-confirmation,
right.
What do you mean by that? Exactly.
If you say, by whatever you do, that you want to be my friend, I confirm that by being friendly back. Your friend, right? Does that make sense? If you get married to somebody and you say we are exclusive to one another, and then the person is not exclusive to you in various ways, is that a violation? Does it disconfirm you? We're going to talk later on about relationship disillusion. Is a part of relationship disillusion blame placing? Blame placing, we've got to explain why the relationship went bad. Blame placing. Why do we do that? Because we've got to account for why the exclusivity broke down. She was a rat, he was a rat. Terribly untrustworthy. Do we go so far as to tell everybody we can? Do we take out an ad? You see what I'm getting at? Because we want now to share that because of that violation. Finally, oh no, not finally, the next one is attachment, liking. To be in a positive relationship, do we have to constantly show liking? Have to constantly show liking. Now you might say, what do you mean constantly show liking? Well, if you and I are together and we're friends, how do you show me that you're my friend? Do you listen to me? Do you smile? Are we perhaps closer together in proximity than we would be if we were not friends, walking further apart? Do we perhaps touch each other as opposed to not touch each other? Do you see what I'm getting at? All kinds of things. Do I make sure that I call you and see how you are, say good morning in a cheery way as opposed to in an indifferent or a gruff way or whatever it might be? See, the notion is that we like to be liked. Now, some of you might say, no, I really dislike being liked. But we call those adolescents who are struggling with that notion of, am I being liked or am I not being liked, and I'm lacking the confidence to really know what's going on at a given time. When I was a high school student, one time a teacher wrote, we had to write essays every week, and one of the essays was, write on someone you love. And I wrote, there is no such thing as love. And I've always said that is so predictably adolescent. There is no such thing as love. Why did I have to say that to the world? Did I really believe it? Did I think that when I went home my parents would have moved out, changed the lock? That no friend out there would pay me any regard if I needed that? Is there no love? You see what I'm saying is? But it is a kind of way of thinking about these things, isn't it? Does music think about those sorts of things? Lyrics, poetry, all of that kind of thing? We are interested in the displays of liking, and we are also interested in the displays of disliking, aren't we? Children are often very awkward at this. They have to get real good skills. Then we get to be adults, and we can become very, very clever in this regard. You say, good morning, how are you? And I totally ignore you. I say, who cares? What's it to you? Do you see what I'm getting at? Conversational pieces, scripts that can display attachment or, in a sense, disattachment. Knowledge. To what extent do we make ourselves known in our liking, etc., etc.? We talked the other day about giving gifts to other people, doing nice things for them. We do so in a routinely normative way, a rules-based way. Why do we do that? Because these are the rituals. My wife worked for a big international engineering firm. Certain business people from other parts of the world would show up with an infinite load of gifts. Gifts for everybody. Gifts. Do we give gifts when we do business with other people? Not necessarily, unless we think they're a high-level customer. Well, you see what I'm getting at is, what is the display, the knowledge of attachment? Do we say that that's really not intimacy? It's not exclusive. You give gifts to everybody, then why am I so special? See how we try to figure out what this means? Meaning then becomes a part of the dimensions of enactment or interactment. Well, okay. Having talked about that, and I'd be happy to stop and talk about it a lot for that matter, if you want to do that, or we can go on and talk a little bit about deception. You're satisfied that you know enough about Millar and Rogers, at least, to go look in the book and learn more and get ready and all of that? See how those nifty little elements there make wonderful little ID questions? Oh boy, do I like that. Deception, theory of deception. We're interested in deception, in interpersonal communication. We can also talk about corporate deception or organizational deception, but a lot of what we do in our interaction is deceive one another. Now, if I were to ask you how good you are at deception detection, most of you would say you're really good. Really good. I can really spot somebody. Deception means like lying, right? Lying, willfully distorting something. What if I were then to ask you, how good are you at counter-deception moves or counter-deception detection moves? What do I mean by that? What do you do if you think you're being caught deceiving someone? Do you have counter-detection moves that you kick in? There's a study in here by a woman, as I recall, by a woman by the name of Dindia, D-I-N-D-I-A, who did a study where she had the persons talking to one another separated by some kind of device that would allow people who were to be the deceivers to be able to see lights in front of them. The lights would show red, yellow, or green. So you and I are in this experiment. I'm the deceiver, and you're the other person. And I was supposed to deceive you at some point in this conversation. And what she wanted to know was that if I think I'm being detected, do I then kick in my counter-deception moves? Which means that we have to know what the signs of deception are and then make moves that show people that we're really not deceiving them. Well, let's look at that. What are some of the assumptions that we make when we think people are deceiving us? Lying to us. You like that word better than deception? Lying to us. What are some of the signs? Yeah.
Like they avoid to look you in the eye.
They won't look you in the eye.
Yeah.
So that if I then, my little red light comes on that says that you have caught me, which is really manipulation, I may almost glare at you, right? Because I know that that is one of the cues, and if I hadn't been looking at you enough, I may now look at you a lot. Because if I know that there is a set of cues that would signal deception, then my counter move is to make sure that I'm doing that. We know, for instance, that hesitancy can be a deception detection. Is that right? That if you're having to make up a story, that you become uncertain in explaining that story. Some of you remember, oh, I'm talking about your adolescence now, aren't I? You got ready to lie to your parents and you practiced the story for 4 days so that you'd get it just right. There would be uhs and ums and ahs and all that kind of stuff, disfluencies. So that if I catch you in deception because there are uhs, what might you say? What? I didn't hear you. I didn't understand that. Would you say that again? Why do you say that? Because it gives you time to think of your stupid story while I'm repeating what my question is. Right? Right. Oh, I'm making some of you feel terribly uncomfortable today, letting you know that we actually study this, that it actually does go on in the world out there. Well, back to the point of deception is, we like to believe that we're not easily deceived. And yet the statistics are that we're really pretty good at deceiving one another. Later on, we're going to add another dimension of this called biased reporting rather than deception. Biased means that I'm not lying to you, but I'm not telling you the truth. Deception means that I'm willfully distorting the truth. Biasing means that I give you false reports of something, but I would pass a polygraph. If you were to ask me about my grandchildren and I said that they are the two most beautiful, wonderful, super duper grandchildren in the world, am I deceiving you? I'll pass a polygraph. Am I biased in my report? You bet. Right? That's why grandmothers don't like one another, because if they listen to somebody else's story about the grandchildren, they got it, you know, and so forth and so forth. Yeah. The difference between deception and debiasing or biased reporting is that deception, I'm willfully trying to lie to you. I think I made the comment once that we found out that our daughter and her chums over at HSPVA would all give us different phone numbers, us parents who were hovering like eagles out there, different phone numbers, and they would invert numbers in the last 4 digits. You can't invert the first ones. Even parents can spot that. Kids give us enough credit not to think we're that stupid, right? But then they give us, oh, did I get those 2 numbers? Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, right? That's deception. But if I tell you my grandkids are really wonderful, that's not deception. That's bias. And it's likely that I'm not going to give the same cues in bias that I will in deception, but you still have to be, to some extent, guarded in my report, or you reinterpret or interpret in different frames, if you like that, my reporting about my grandchildren. See what I'm getting at? Well, it could be extreme opinion, but it's just that notion of when I look at my grandkids, you know, I really do think they're special. And are they really that much different than anybody else's grandkids? Well, honestly, probably not.
Just personal.
Favoring? Well, it could be. I think that's what I'm doing with my grandkids, is favoring them, right?
Your perspective?
It's my perspective. And you can understand that, right? You say, oh, you're their granddad. Now that frames the entire report, doesn't it? Does that make me a dishonest person?
Partially? No, I'm joking.
Yeah. Does it threaten our relationship because it violates trust? Actually, the argument might be that you trust me more because you see that I'm willing to be biased in reporting about people that I'm very fond of, which then you might say, hey, that can work for me too. You see what I'm getting at? That's a reciprocation. And we do that, don't we? You folks hope we do when we report about you as students, that we are biased towards you, that we like you. And so when it comes times for internship meetings, that we give a wonderfully glowing report about you, which may not be that true, but you're hoping that we are biased in your favor, right? And it's not deception. It is reporting with a, what, unduly favorable or unduly negative kind of interpretation to a set of facts. So, okay, deception. Assumptions and baseline data are used to detect deception. What do I mean by that? Well, we have this whole set of codes, the criteria that we look at to determine whether somebody's telling us the truth or not. And we'll look at some of those later on. I can point to the page in the book where those pop up. I actually thought I had it marked. Maybe I do. Nope, I don't, but I've got it now. It's on page 243, 244. We can look at those in just a minute. And secondly, baseline data. One of the assumptions that we make is that I have to have motivation to spot you in deception. I have to have motivation to spot you in deception. If I go to a car dealership, do I have motivation to spot the salesperson in deception? And I can also distinguish between biased reporting and deception. But it gets more blurred there than it does with Granddad, doesn't it? Because the two things come to be much closer together.
I had a person in class one time say that one of her children, an older woman, one of her children, she always knew when he was lying, and the other one, she never knew when he was lying. Part of it was baseline data, right? Baseline data. Meaning that if I use your disfluencies or your reluctances to speak as a part of the code, then I have to know what your normal speech is, because deception is abnormal disfluency. Does that make sense? Abnormal disfluency. Same thing is true in terms of eye contact. Years ago at the University of New Mexico, I had an opportunity to sit in on seminars that were being conducted for Anglo teachers going to teach on the Navajo reservation. If a Navajo child is confronted by an adult on an issue that has to do with something like theft, did you take such and such? Our cultural bias, as she said, is that you look in the eye when you make a report. What is the greatest insult for a Navajo child in talking to an adult? To look into the eyes. So therefore, every Anglo interprets the nonverbal communication of the Navajo children. They're all liars. Do you see what I'm getting at? It's because we have these criteria that we use to judge people. And we have baseline data that we can tell. Are women more likely to catch men lying than men are to catch women lying? Oh, you bet. You bet. They're better at this than we are, guys. Don't you ever, 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 ever doubt that. People are not terribly good at deception, we say, and can use counter detection strategies if necessary. Well, let's look at some of these points of interaction where we look to see if there's deception going on. Less contact, such as avoiding eye contact. I may even turn away from you. If I don't want to be perceived as lying, one of the things I might do is just get up and leave the room, because I deny you a lot of cues that you might have to spot my lying. Is that right? More control over what is said and how. Does that sound like Bill Clinton? I will define what I mean by having had sex with that woman. And if you buy my definition, and I am the president, then you too will agree with me. And then the rest of us are out there saying, but you know what? It just doesn't sound like our sense of what the world is. More control over what is said and how. One of the things we know, for instance, that topic shifting can be a factor, can't it? Topic shifting. If you don't want to talk about something, you say, oh my God, look at that bug on the wall. We're not talking about bugs on the wall, young woman. We're talking about, this sounds very much like your parents, doesn't it? Well, you're getting all of these scripts down. You see, I always tell students that when you're an adolescent, you ought to just make a tape recording of all of these scripts, because you're going to need them someday. And all you do is just play them back when you have children. And then people say that blessed is the child who has children, because onto them too comes the blessings of children, right? And so forth. Blessings with quotation marks. Less smiling. If I'm caught in a deception, I may become, see why baseline data become important? Here's a smiley person that's not smiling anymore. Have you ever said, why have you quit smiling? And we guys don't get it when you women ask us that question. Yeah.
I don't agree with that.
You don't?
No, when I'm talking to my boyfriend and he's like, did you do your homework? I'm like, no. And I start smiling and he knows I didn't do my homework.
Yeah, but that would be then a cue perhaps to that relationship. But the same token, if he were your parents and asked you that.
It depends on the topic too. If it's like really detrimental.
Yeah.
You want me to smile. But if it's something really trivial, you want
I would say so too, yeah. The more serious it is, the more serious we become. And somebody then spots our deception by saying, the minute ago they were cheery and now they're not. And why? Because they're having to concentrate on getting this story right so that it sounds right, huh? More postural shift, meaning twisting. There's something called adrenaline that kicks in. Longer pauses. What did you say? I'm working on my story.
a slower rate of communication because I'm having to make this truth up as I go along, and more importantly, I'm trying to remember it. So that 3 days from now, if you ask me, I will remember what I told you. Get on a stand, you hear it all the time, right? The witness contradicted herself, himself, from the deposition. Story's got to be straight in a sense, right? Okay. Slower speech rate, more speech errors, wrong word selection. We call them Freudian slips, don't we? Anything to hide the fact that we're really thinking about something and not monitoring the word selection that we've got, and maybe even we let the wrong word slip in. Oh, did I say that? Well, I didn't mean that. Hesitancies, ums and uhs. Less immediacy. We talk about immediacy being that sort of genuine sense that the child is what the child feels and says. We become less that. We become a bit more controlled, a little bit more artificial, a little bit less immediate. Higher vocal pitch. Our voice goes up when we're nervous. Same thing happens when people give speeches in public speaking class. Their voices go up because their vocal cords are getting very tight. More nonverbal adapters. Nonverbal adapters are, for instance, something like, well, we'll talk about nonverbals in just a moment, but something like, I'm becoming more animated. I may become more animated. I may also become more closed. That's why this baseline becomes important. Know what the norm is. We see violations of the norm. We begin to say, got my radar going out there. Then you say, caught, got to go into counter detection moves. Less time spent answering questions. Your parents say, where have you been? Nowhere. What have you been doing? Nothing. Oh, good. I'm so glad. 7 days you've been gone. You've been nowhere and you've done nothing. I understand. Makes perfectly good sense to me. Why don't you want to talk about it? Have nothing to say. Why don't you want to talk about it? Because you don't know whether your story will hold up. That's the answer. You've smiled. You've been there. Decreased use of illustrators. Decreased use of illustrators. Or maybe sometimes the increased use of illustrators. Well, we've kind of been talking about some of this. Let me quickly go through this. We have learned guidelines for deception detection. We emphasize that these are culturally sensitive. Lying in certain cultures is quite a bit different than lying in other cultures. We are variously skilled at detection. People who are in the detection business, like police officers, interrogators, and so forth, they become increasingly skilled. They even have devices which they can use, like polygraph, etc., to raise the chances that they can spot this detection. We need baseline data to really feel that we are able to make comparisons when they're telling the truth and when they're deceiving us. We also know that sometimes in deception there is an element of a self-fulfilling prophecy. That when we think that somebody is deceiving us, they then begin to deceive us as a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. There is a motivation to detect deception because we don't like uncertainty. There also are counter-deception moves, and there is deception planning and skill, as well as there is deception planning or detection and skill. It's ironic in my mind, but you talk about people being good journalists. I would argue that often what distinguishes good journalists from less competent journalists are people that are able to get through deception, detect it, find out what's really going on, be able to spot it, often dealing with people that are incredibly good at deception. One of the interesting battles in our society is that between reporters and politicians. Is it possible that politicians, on average, in society, are more able to deceive than other segments of the population? Are we cynical? We sure don't trust them. We sure don't like them. And therefore, if we're a journalist, I was listening yesterday to an NPR journalist saying, I caught this person with the evidence reading verbatim. And the guy said, well, if that's your interpretation of the story, that's fine. It's not the facts. And he said, I had just presented the facts. And the person simply spun the story, I hate that word, by saying, those are not the facts. But those are the facts. I just read you statements. Those are the facts. And you deny that they're the facts, right? And the politician may be the one that can get away with that and do it so admirably, right? So admirably. Well, anyway, some of this has to do with nonverbal communication. One of the interesting studies done a number of years ago suggested that 60% of communication is all nonverbal. Well, that's how it's usually reported. That's a misnomer. When we think about communication, we can think often of two dimensions of communication. One is the content as content, and one as the sort of socio-emotional cues that surround the content. And what the study actually says is that as much as 60% of the content of a socio-emotional kind in communication is communicated non-verbally. Even the selection of words, which is verbal communication, can convey emotion, can't it? The other day, one of the faculty members in the School of Communication, printer was putting out putting out pages. I said, it's spewing. I said, do I get high marks for spewing? He said, yes. And he actually had some sort of grading scale that he would write something in the margin. Spewing is a great word. Is spewing more emotional than putting out in terms of paper? It's spewing paper, it's putting out paper, it's ejecting paper, it's emitting paper. You see, we can even have words that have emotional quality to it. The word love has certain emotional quality, the word hate, the word friend, and so forth. So words themselves can have emotional quality, yeah. 60%, something like that. It's more of an illustrative study than it ever is anything else. That study's been bannered around probably more than any other single study other than the Bobo the Doll study, which we'll talk about later on. Okay, well, where does all of this lead us then? The argument is that nonverbal communication counts. Where does it count most? We will say it counts most in the context of interpersonal communication. How much of interpersonal communication is based upon nonverbal communication, nonverbal cues? And what are those cues? How can we categorize them? And then what you can also read in the chapter are studies that look at these kinds of things, and we're going to get more into this because later on we're going to talk about violation, and sometimes in the violation of the norms of communication, these violations are nonverbal. Violations are nonverbal, for instance. Okay, paralanguage, one of the kinds of nonverbal communication. Paralanguage has to do with the way in which we modify what we state by the tone of our voice, the loudness of our speech, or the softness of our speech. Could be the emotion that we convey in our speech, either happiness or it could be sorrow. It's the way in which the sounds of our voice, in an accompaniment to the words that we say, define those words for the other person, or the other person uses those cues to define the words. For instance, if I say I love you, in one sense, does how I say that word or those words make a difference in how you think I love you? And if we're in a romantic relationship, don't I have to figure out how to say it so that it sounds right to you? You don't really love me, you don't say it right. And we guys say, well, at least we said it. We're so confused. This is all very difficult for us. We're just trying to make it up as we go along and so forth and etc. And oh my gosh. Right? The words that we use count, but the way in which we say the words can help. It was a big fish. It was a big fish. It was a big fish. How big was that fish? It got bigger as I went along, and I didn't modify it by putting an adjective in front. I simply emphasized the adjective by my voice, right? One of the things that we talk about later on is that if we say to a child, do you want to go somewhere, and they don't say yes happily enough, we think they don't want to go. Does that make sense? And we then say, well, I guess I won't go. My wife and I have been at that for 38 years. You want to go to town? Well, that's fine. Well, I guess we won't go. Why? Because you didn't say you want to go to town. Well, how do I say it right? You never do. Well, let's go to town. I'm mad now. I never want to see you. Leave. Goodbye. Right? There we are. We had a fight over what? I didn't say something right. I didn't say it with the right paralanguage. Words mean something, but they mean something different based upon the way in which we say them. And we use that as cues, decoding cues, interpretive cues. Proxemics. Proxemics, the strategic use of space or the study of the use of space, either way we look at it. I talked earlier about an intimacy move. An intimacy move means I get closer to you. I get closer to you. I doubt that any of you are old enough to remember a television program named by the name of Laugh-In. But Artie Johnson and Ruth Buzzy slid up and down a bench for 20 years or so out there, right? He would be romantically advancing, or maybe not romantically advancing. And she would, move away, and then she would finally hit him with her purse. So that if I move towards you and you move toward me, that's different than if I move towards you and you get up and leave. Distance, you see. We also in our society like space, don't we? You want to know how wealthy I am? I got more space than you do. That's a Texas way of thinking, doesn't it? I got 380,000 acres. I've got a 2,700 square foot house. Bill Gates has got 11,000 square foot house. The space that I command can be, right? My office is at the top. You know, before a guy named Otis developed an elevator where the senior management were in the company? First floor. Why? They didn't walk up. The lower you were, the higher you were in the country. Then Otis developed an elevator and it all reversed. If you were the lowest person in the company, you're at the bottom because the top people want to be at the top, right? I got to go to the 47th floor the other day. Students go in and said, I went to the 34th floor. I must be really being treated well, right? Space, how we deal with space, how much of it we've got, where it is, movement, moving closer, moving away with one another. If, for instance, you and I are mad at one another, are we likely to get closer? Well, we might be. Hitting each other is a way of getting closer. But getting away, saying, I got to get away from you. I'm going to leave. Isn't leaving a pretty profound statement about space? See? Space, the study of space. One of my favorite studies. You can go out and spend the week now studying this. Get into an elevator by yourself. Establish yourself right in the middle. The door opens. People get in. You don't move. What are they likely to do? Let the doors close. Why? Because you're supposed to give them some share of the space. Got 5 people in the elevator. 2 of them get out. We all waltz to redefine the space. It's now divided not by 5, but by 3. I've got 33% of the space instead of 20% of the space. Do you ever get that feeling, right? It's the waltz in there. What about the person who, when everybody else gets out and you and he or she are right there together, and you're against the wall, so you can't move, and they don't move? Do you like that? You've got more than your half of this elevator. Get over, move. We sometimes will, do all kinds of weird things to get away from them because they're in our space. We even go so far as to say, you're in my face. You're too close to me. Becomes threatening. I had friends who were first generation Italians. Italians do not talk to one another if they're more than 3 inches apart. And if they really want to get angry with one another, they got to get close. And you would think that they're at war. No, they're Italians. So we go to visit the Norwegians up in Minneapolis. Do they fight at 3 inches? Do they fight at 9 feet? Right? Cultural differences in the use of space. Now that becomes a problem. A Norwegian talks to an Italian. And the Italian is getting way too close and the Norwegian is backing up. And the Italian is saying, don't you like me because you won't stay and let me get close? And so we have these strange waltzes, don't we? We have these strange waltzes. We also call it hugging. I married into a hugging family. I came from a non-hugging family. We really liked people in our family, but we didn't hug each other. I went to my wife's family with 9 aunts in southern Arkansas, and I honestly felt it was Saturday Night Wrestling. That used to be Saturday Night Wrestling, then it became World Wrestling Federation. There was a whole lot more mauling going on than I never to this day perfected all of these wonderful little. And then you even watch the students on campus, right? National origins, various kinds of kisses and hugs and all of this kind of stuff, right? We do all of that. These are rituals of identification. We're going to talk later upon identification. That becomes very important to us, doesn't it? Kinesics. Kinesics is moving to and from somebody. If I am in a fight and I turn my back on you, that's kinesics. If I lean toward you, that's kinesics. If I gesture, that's kinesics. It is a study of movement and positioning and its effect on or occurrence in interpersonal communication. Do I gesture too much? Yes, but I'm Italian. Do I gesture too little? Yes, but I'm Norwegian. See, some of it is cultural. But we can have cross-cultural communication problems without knowing it. I one time had a good friend, student, who was Nigerian. Very proper guy, raised in the British colonial educational system. It's a very structured system. And got to know him well enough, I wanted to know the most obscene gesture that a person from Nigeria, or at least his cultural group in Nigeria, would use. He couldn't show me. Couldn't show me. Why? Because it was too much of an insult to do that in the presence of a faculty member. I said, well, just tell me. Oh, couldn't begin to do that. It would be an insult, right? And now, of course, we have a generation of people that believe that nonverbal signals are a very normal, expected part of their life. We give a peace sign, we give half of a peace sign, we do all of this kind of thing. And then we wonder why we have road rage and all of this kind of stuff. It's because we don't know which number of digits to use at what game. We even have cougars and we have longhorns. And see, all of this is kinesics, isn't it? Kinesics. Even how we walk. Do we walk differently in our own cultural milieu than we do in a diverse cultural milieu? There's some studies. There was a video a number of years called The Rhetoric of the Streetwalker, and it had nothing to do with prostitutes, but it had to do with people walking differently in their native community, and then when they got into regular business community, they walked differently.
walk differently. Why? Because we show identity often by our nonverbal communication. Haptics, touch. Can mothers touch children in different ways than fathers? Yes. It's amazing, isn't it? Because mothers have been doing it a lot longer in a lot more intimate ways. Mothering is different than fathering in that particular regard. Touch. Handshakes. How about that? You get ready to go out on your job internship interview? What kind of a handshake you supposed to have? How much do we tell about people by their handshakes? A good, firm handshake. Get a hold of somebody's hand and limp. Well, they're just a wimp. I wouldn't hire them. I got a friend who has a friend from Minnesota, and when Glenn shows up, Glenn says, "Hi, how about a handshake?" "No, Glenn, no, 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 no." He's a guy that believes if no blood is squeezed out of your head, he's not friendly enough. "No, no, Glenn, no, don't touch me." Right? How firm should a handshake be? Should it break bones? Should we hear popping? Should it be like a dead fish? What do we get at here? What are we saying about ourselves? What is our personality? Isn't it amazing how much of all of this we make by what are relatively simple cues? Haptics, touch, when, where, how. We talk about intimacy moves and so forth, right? See? We even have laws. We even have laws on some of these kinds of things. For instance, we have gender discrimination, or we have a threatening work environment where people get too close or they touch us in inappropriate ways. And we have laws on all of that sort of thing. Chronemics. Chronemics. If I am from standard American society and I invite you to dinner and you were born and raised in Mexico, and I say be there at 7 and I've got the skillet hot at 7, it's going to be cool by 9, but there you are. "Hi, here I am, just on time." But it was 7. Oh, that's right, it was 7. 7 plus 2 is 7. See what I'm getting at? Chronemics, time. We have different senses of time. One time my wife and I invited a couple over to our house for dinner. They were from the Netherlands. We said dinner at 6. They showed up at 5. Because they're supposed to come and help make the dinner. And isn't it interesting when you're doing that, you're in your underwear until that last moment? Here we were in our underwear and the Netherlanders are showing up. They're out front. Chronemics. Chronemics, time. Time. I've got a good friend, I've got a daughter, I've got a son-in-law. We say about our daughter and son-in-law, they're working on his family name time, right? Give them 2 hours, they'll be here. Never plan anything without a 2-hour leeway. Time doesn't count for very much, right? So you see what I'm getting at is that this becomes a part of these rituals. And when we talk about social exchange, we talked about timing. When do I have to link what it is that I've done so that you know that I'm reciprocating all of this kind of thing? Chronemics. Physical appearance. Physical appearance. I said something the other day. I hope I didn't tear up your heart and mind and soul and identity. But people my age, when we look at young people with all that wire hanging out of them, we don't think you look pretty. I've never heard anybody my age say, "God, I am so looking forward to going down and getting my face filled with wire." They're just exactly the people that I want to hire when they come into my office. My son-in-law had his ear pierced. He got through college, went to work, hasn't worn that earring at work. Why? Because appearance sometimes counts. It's also interesting, you look around a classroom like this, we're a t-shirt set, aren't we? Sort of like that. People have various kinds of advertisements on their t-shirts. He's advertising Austin something over there. I have no idea what he's advertising here. Somebody the other day was advertising that his fraternity was somehow special because John Kennedy, a fraternity brother, had slept with Marilyn Monroe. We advertise to the world all kinds of things about us. That we're yuppies. We wear logos on our shirts.
We're cowboys, we wear hats, we have on our jeans back here strategically the circle of our Copenhagen can so that people will know that we're snooze chewers. Wouldn't be seen in public without my snooze chewing circle on my hip pocket, right? You see what I'm getting at? We look at gender. I find it interesting in terms of physical appearance. The feminist movement increased the likelihood that men could look like women, but they didn't do anything of the reverse. So this weekend, I guess I can't wear my best favorite blue chiffon in public, as my daughter could go around looking more like me because of her t-shirts and her blue jeans. Well, anyway, we've solved some of the mysteries of interpersonal communication as I get down to my last 32 seconds. We'll see you on Tuesday of next week.
Thank you.